Hey, team, and welcome to Unit 2, Day 3, Japan. So, after reading early history and culture of Japan, learners will be able to cite textual evidence through four text based questions, scoring 66%. After revision, RH 910.1, our historical skill for the day, will be citing textual evidence. And for all you anime heads, today's your day. So, first off, Japan is not an island. Many people call it an island nation, but it is in fact an archipelago, aka a chain of many smaller islands. So, early in its history, it was strongly influenced by China, and the core of Japanese culture starts in the lower islands. The main four islands, of course, are Sheikoyu, Jushu, Honshu, and Hokkaidote. Hokkaidote was the newest island. Actually, it was not inhabited continuously until the 1800s. Previous to that, it was very archaic clan system, which was not of interest to most of the dynasties of Japan. So, the first thing that we're going to learn about Japan is that it's very mountainous. So, four-fifths of Japan is a series of mountains. As you can see in the topographical map to your right, we see its most famous mountain, of course, Mount Fuji. To our left, it is hard to farm mountains. We have discussed geography matters in multiple occasions, but the Japanese actually had a very clever way to get around it. It was called terrace farming. So what they would do is they would build into the mountain, pardon, haul out a handful of the rocky dirt and then replace it with good arable soil, enabling them to grow on the mountainside. So this is called terrace farming. And everything else comes from the sea. So the sea is so central to the identity of the Japanese. The sea is in every way entwined with Japanese life. That's why when you think of Japan, when I say, oh, what's Japanese food? You don't think of Japanese Wagyu beef, which is some of the finest beef in all of the world. You probably don't even think about ramen, which is very popular. No, your head's probably going to go to sushi. And that makes sense because since it is a very mountainous island, they have very little natural resources. A lot of the slack of feeding its people comes from the sea. So the sea is a core industry in Japan, and it's a core part of its legend. So every great ancient city and civilization has a creator's legend. Japan is no different. A divine being sheds its clothes and dives into the sea. And with that, it creates the critters of the sea. And in more recent history of Japan, they were looking to be invaded by the Mongols and the Chinese Yuan dynasty. But as they sat and they were defeated on some remote islands, they retreated to the mainland of Honshu and they watched Kublai Khan's massive army getting ready to ride across to Honshu. And a miraculous typhoon comes through and wipes out the army. This happens again when the Mongols send an even greater force, and this time it destroys almost the entire fleet, and those who do come ashore are easily defeated by the Japanese. Finally, the third and final attempt, the Japanese had created a wall around Honshu, and when the Mongol invading forces were unable to find an entry port, they had to just stay ashore, adrift, until they wore out all of their supplies, and again were destroyed by what would become known as the Divine Wind, or the kamikaze. Not to be confused with the kamikaze pilots that we know. Kamikaze originally means divine wind. It was the divine spirit protecting Japan from outside invaders using tsunamis. So inside this PowerPoint, there is a video of a tsunami. I'm not going to make you watch a YouTube video on a YouTube video. We're not YouTube-ceptioning, but you can click on it if you like in your free time. So, the Yamato Clan are the original dynasty of Japan, and the current imperial line actually descends or traces their lineage to the Yamato Clan. And the Yamato Clan they claim their descent is from the sun goddess Amaterasu. Amaterasu. And I don't watch a lot of anime, sorry, guys. And the rising sun became the Yamata symbol. They ruled the government from the island of Honshu, but the outer rims of the islands will not be united for quite some time. So we talked about this in our last class when we were talking about Korea. So Korea has a big influence on Japan because Buddhism will come to Korea in 372 Common Era. And then in the 500 Common Era, the Korean Buddhist monastery or missionaries will come to Japan. So while learning about Buddhism, they start to become interested in Chinese civilization. They build their capital modeled after the Chinese capital. The Chinese bring the tea drinking and tea ceremonies to the island from China. And we talked about this in the Korean empires, about how Korea will become the go-between between Japan and China. So the Japanese, during the time of the Tang court, will start to send their nobles to China to study, to learn in Confucian ideas. So in 1600, Prince Shokutoyu of the Yamato clan sends nobles to study in China. As a result, Japan sets up its government in a similar way to the Chinese government, but not exactly. Because they are very entrenched with selective borrowing. So the Japanese do not allow the outside cultures to fully influence them. They only take what they truly want. So Koreans are more advanced in ironworking and sword making, so they will adopt those techniques. But the Chinese have civil service exams, which goes against Japanese culture of field piety. So there's an element of social mobility with the civil service exams, which the Japanese weren't particularly comfortable with. They believe very strongly that the world had a social order, that there were superior and inferior, and that all must learn to respect this system. So when it comes to selective borrowing, you can think of this as a can of Coca-Cola in Japan, because Coca-Cola is great. And why wouldn't they want to take Coca-Cola? And this is a can of RC Cola in America, and you're never going to find it in Japan because RC Cola is terrible. So feudalism is going to break out here. So they've been studying from the very feudal Chinese, but on the outskirts of society, rival clans are battling for control, and they are struggling for power. And inevitably, they're going to start to form a hierarchy on the island of these warlords on the edge, and eventually it would actually de-escalate as they start to respect this system. A new warrior aristocracy will develop under a figurehead emperor, and it is called Japanese Shogunate feudalism. So we see here at the very tippy top, there is a military commander called the shogun. This is the real power of feudal Japan. The emperor exists. The emperor is more of a rubber stamp. It is a religious figurehead. And the shogun is the real power. You could see this in Great Britain. We know that the queen exists, but the queen kind of just exists. And the real power in the British government is the British prime minister. So the emperor is similar to the Queen of England, where the shogun is like the prime minister, except this prime minister is really good at war. And below them is the Damio, below them is the samurai, and then, of course, at the very lowest class is the peasants. This is a very simplified version because there's actually people who live below their lowest class, but we'll get to them. So the class of warrior, as I said, we have the shogun, which is supreme military commander, the daimyo, which is the great warrior lords. These are the warrior lords that are obviously battling for control, and under the shogun, they are granted land, and they will hire samurai to fight underneath them for mostly land, materials, and favor. The samurai will then follow the code of Bushito, a strict code of behavior similar to chivalry that existed with European knights. Gi, integrity; rei, respect; yu, heroic courage; mayo, honor; jin, compassion; makato, honesty and sincerity; and chu, duty and loyalty. So this is Bushito. So this is not on your test. This is just for fun. I want to talk to you guys about the artistic traditions of Japan. So they have two main stage shows called No and Kabuki. No is performed on a wooden stage without scenery, just masks and melodrama. This is going to develop into the 1300s, where Kabuki, on the other hand, will be much more elaborate. It will have comedies, melodrama, violence, emotion. It's going to portray family and historic events. This is the mainstream media of the time. If No is artistic indie films, Kabuki is their version of the Avengers. And in poetry, they create the haiku, which of course you've had in English class, and they also have wood block printing. That develops into the 1600s. To give you guys a couple examples, you can see some of the masks that are made, the elaborate costumes. You can just see all of these elements of their very rich art forms that are very unique to their own culture. So the Kamakura shogunate will take form in the 1100s. Two powerful clans, the Taira and the Yamato, fight for control for the 30 years to try to emerge as the shogun. So Miyamoto does emerge victorious, and in 1129, Yorihito Miyamoto will take the title of shogun. The shogun, Miyamoto, in 1147 to 1199, will set up the first of three military dynasties that will rule Nippon, which is Japanese name, for 700 years. So this goes to the Heian period. So the capital is moved at this time from Nara to Heian, and the Heian period is considered the peak of Japanese imperial court, noted for its art, poetry, and literature. And by court, we mostly mean bureaucracy. This is a period of time where the nobles are quite well off, and in order to keep themselves busy, they add as much steps to everything as possible. Some have called it the era of wasting time. The emperors are both Confucian and Shinto, so they do adhere to the mandate of heaven, but the Fujiwara family is in control of the throne for the Heian period. And it is a sophisticated period. Like I said, they made an art form of wasting time. They developed these very distinct and regimented rules that applied to etiquette, dress, and language. So getting ready every day was this big, long ordeal that by the time you were done, most of your day was done. Court etiquette was governed society and was all based on beauty. So they had these elaborate dresses. Women had to wear their hair long to their feet so that they could do it up in elaborate ways. They would blacken their teeth. As you can see, they had just really made an art form of making the mundanities of the day last forever. But at this time, they're also obligated to create art and literature. And this is where we get our first novel in human history that we know of, The Tale of Genji from Lady Murasaki. It was a very opulent time, and opulence usually falls to war. And Sengoku is the Warring States period, which will take place between 1467 and 1568. This is where the powerful daimios start to war amongst themselves. So throughout all of this opulence, there starts to be somewhat of a power struggle of ambition. That was the word I was looking for. So also at this time, conversely, the first Europeans are starting to arrive in Japan, particularly the seafaring Portuguese, who start to bring Catholicism, but more importantly, they start to bring firearms. So Oda Nobunaga will eventually defeat all of his rivals. Simply put, he starts to use firearms for the first time effectively in battle. By 1590, he had firm control of the shogunate. His predecessor, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, will take over, and it all comes down to guns. Don't bring a knife to a gunfight. That is how Nobunaga was able to take over Japan, because, again, gun versus sword outside of anime, gun's gonna win. So this would be known from 1603 to 1863, the Tokugawa Shogunate. The Tokugawa Shogunate will control Japan for a 200, almost over a 200-year period. And the core aspect of the Tokugawa Shogunate is Sakoyu, which is strict isolationism. Japan sees the ways that these foreign influences are starting to change their island. Nobunaga was able to utilize foreigners' techniques in order to decimate his opponents. They're very concerned about the influence of Catholicism, mostly about deism, God, the worship of God, because it stands so far against what they are accustomed to, which is Shinto, which is the worship of nature and spirits and ancestral lines, Buddhism and Confucianism, which are both aspects to try to overwhelm or try to go past your earthly desires. Now here's Catholicism, which is somewhat of the antithesis of this, especially at this time, because at this time, the church is selling indulgences. There's quite a bit of corruption. This is past the time of the Protestant Reformation, but still, there's quite a lot of opulence with the Catholic Church. So in 1600, missionaries and Japanese Christians are persecuted. They are thrown out, they are executed. And in 1639, the Japanese ban almost all contact with the outside world. They go into a policy of strict isolationism. If you were a castaway, if you were trading with the Koreans and you were so unfortunate that you shipwrecked outside of Japan and you landed ashore, you were assured to be killed. Unless you were Dutch. The Dutch were cool. The Dutch were fierce Protestants at this time. They had just gained their independence from a pretty fierce war with the Catholic Spanish. And the Dutch were allowed to maintain trade. So the Dutch are the only, and only at one port, but they are allowed to continue trade with the Japanese because they would keep their Protestant ways to themselves and simply trade in goods and services. But then looked like Japan needed some freedom, and that's what America brought. So foreigners can't come into Japan, and the Japanese, once they leave, they can't come back. They ban all ocean-going ships. They cannot be made in the land of the rising sun. So this is really going to strengthen its homogeneous culture, and they're very unified because, again, there is no other ethnicity. Everyone is Japanese. Until 1854, until the black ships arrive, Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States shows up to Japan with 8 coal-powered, steam-powered warships and suggests, and only somebody in warships can, that the Japanese open up to trade with the United States of America. And the Japanese, staring down the literal barrel of a gun, oblige. But they're also forced to just recognize how far they are behind the rest of the world. At this time, since they essentially only have one trading partner, and they are told to, and their trading partner is told to maintain the status quo or else, they are very poor in trade and they have no industry whatsoever. But that's about to change with the Meiji Restoration. So the Tokugawa ends the shogunate, and they start this period of modernization. So they move the capital from Kyoto to Tokyo. They abolish the shoguns, the samurais. They establish this new modern government with a legislative branch and a constitution. And within 50 years, by the time the Japanese-Russian War starts, they have gone from one of the least advanced nations in the world to one of the most modern. Industry and trade thrives. The only problem is they don't have a lot of natural resources. In order to get natural resources, they're going to need a foothold in mainland Asia. So this is when things get a bit uncomfortable. But that's for your US 2 teacher to talk about. Because we're done. You will discuss this during US 2 with the lead up to World War II. Today, you just have to complete this Newsela article. Make sure that you annotate it. Blue, point of view. Yellow, author's claim. Green, keywords. Red, you better ask me a question if you want credit. Otherwise, everybody, be smart, be safe. Have a good one, everybody. See you next time.